Hey, I'm Taylor, and this is Another Feral Feminist. Hey, everybody. I am a day late. I know. I'm sorry. Not that any of you really noticed, but I wanted to make sure that I really gave this story the deep dive that it deserved. There was a lot of information that I wanted to cover, and it just took longer than I had slated for this project. Anyway, we are here. We are back. It is done. It is ready. Let's go. One more piece of business I want to talk about before we really get into it. I know the audio sucked last time. I am a beginner, okay? And I think that I have found a solution for it. So if it's better this time, that's incredible. If it's not, let me know and I will continue to search for solutions. But hopefully I fixed it and it's amazing and incredible and I sound like a real professional. Anyway, before we really go headfirst into today's story, I want to tell you a little personal tale. And it's actually something that I have seen happen to many women. And honestly, if it hasn't happened to you directly, you probably know somebody that it has happened to. So, back when I was working in corporate America, I had a job where a male coworker would constantly make like weird, out of pocket comments. Not the kind of stuff that would get him fired, obviously, but just the kind of stuff that makes you feel super icky. Like you got to go home and take a shower afterward. So, one time, and this is sort of how it all started, he walks up to me and he's like, "Hey, you are cute and professional." And I didn't think much of it, but then it escalated a few weeks later. And he walks up to me during a meeting and he's like, "Wow, you're really intense, but like in a hot way." And I wanted to throw up all over my laptop. Over time, he got bold enough to where he would like start making comments on my appearance. And he'd say things like, "Yeah, you just have this natural beauty. Not many women have that." Ugh, sorry, it still creeps me out. And the one that finally got him reported, this was back in the day of pencil skirts, and I wore a pencil skirt to work. And he walks up to my desk and he's like, "Damn, you must really kill it at happy hour." And I melted into a pile of vomit. And then when I came back to my human form, I decided that I really needed to report him. But I was super concerned that HR wouldn't find these spread out seemingly innocuous comments serious enough to warrant an official report. Listen, I was young. I didn't know any better. So I brought it up to my manager instead, who was another dude, of course. And looking back, like this is probably where I went wrong because he tells me, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll talk to him." That was on a Friday. And I was walking out of work that day and I saw them walking together and they got into the same vehicle. And that sounds a lot more salacious than it is, but evidently they went to the bar every Friday for happy hour. I should have known. But anyway, the next week, there was a noticeable shift in my coworker's behavior, which, whatever. In spite of what I saw, I was like, great. At the very least, they'll talk about me behind my back and he'll leave me alone. Like, I don't give a shit. But over the next few weeks, I started to notice that I was not being looped in on priority projects anymore. And when I would offer my feedback in meetings on these projects, like as a professional with expertise on these projects' main objectives, I was ignored. And I brought it up and I was told, quote, "Oh, well, I hadn't been caught up to speed on those particular projects yet." The projects all have the same objectives. It didn't make any sense. And then when performance reviews came around like 4 months later, and listen, I was always a top performer. I have a tendency to be a bit of an overachiever, to my fault a lot of the time. But during this performance review cycle, my reviews were absolutely abysmal, but also like super vague. You know how if you're in the corporate world, you know that you're supposed to have SMART goals. And so one of those aspects of a SMART goal is that any feedback that you receive is supposed to be actionable. So you need to be able to get that feedback and then know which direction you have to go in afterward to either adjust or improve or whatever. So the feedback that I got, none of it was actionable. There wasn't anything I could do about it. Essentially, they were just like, yeah, you suck. And that's all there is to it. I didn't get fired, but it was obvious that I was on thin ice. And, it made it super easy to leave when I did a few months later. But that is what retaliation looks like for a lot of women. It's not always some dramatic ordeal or like a public humiliation. Sometimes, and most of the time, honestly, it is a quiet, calculated push out of the professional circles that they know they belong at. And my story is not super rare. What is rare, however, is when a woman refuses to let the truth be buried. Most of us never get that chance, right? We leave quietly, we try again somewhere else, just like I did. But every now and then, a woman says, no, 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 no. You don't get to do this to me and then pretend that you didn't. And that is exactly what the woman who took on Uber did. She did not just speak up. She wrote it all down and then she published it. And it went absolutely viral with over 22,000 shares on Twitter alone. And on the blog that she actually posted it on, I believe it ended up having like 6 million visits, which is a lot even for today's standards. And this was back in 2017. So what happened after she published her story was ugly. And quite frankly, it is a textbook example on how the patriarchy protects itself, especially when it is threatened by a woman who is not afraid to tell the truth. So this is the story of another feral feminist, Susan Fowler. Now, I think it's important to talk about where Susan comes from before we really get into her experience at Uber, because when I say that this woman is a feral feminist, I mean that with my whole heart, with every fiber of my being. So let's start from the beginning. Susan Fowler was born on April 17th, 1991 in Traverse City, Michigan, and ended up being the second oldest of 7 kids. When she was 6 years old, her family moved to Congress, Arizona, where her dad was going to take on a job as a preacher who had a very meager salary. And her mother was going to stay home and homeschool all 7 of the kids. More power to her, because Lord have mercy. Now, I want you to remember this homeschooling thing because it is going to become pivotal later in Susan's story. Now, in her memoir, Whistleblower, she mentions how one night she overheard her mom telling her dad that year they'd made $5,000 for the entire year, which gives you an idea of the kind of poverty that Susan grew up in. Because remember, this was in the 90s. It wasn't that long ago. And according to the inflation calculator today, that would be less than $10,000 for the entire year. That shakes out to like, I don't know, around $800 a month. That is extreme poverty. Even with social assistance, with 7 kids, I can't even imagine. When Susan was in her early teens, her family's financial situation became much more dire, and her mother did end up having to go back into the workforce. And so this meant that she was no longer able to homeschool Susan or her siblings anymore. Now, while Susan's younger brothers and sisters were able to be enrolled in a local public elementary school, according to her memoir, Susan just wasn't at the academic level that she needed to be, and she hadn't taken any of the required state testing, so they would not let her enroll in the public high school. And her mom just essentially told her that she was going to have to get comfortable homeschooling herself. And that's exactly what she did. She picked up part-time jobs to help her family make ends meet. And then at night, she taught herself. From philosophy to literature to languages, these were the kind of things that really lit her brain on fire. She was a voracious reader, and these subjects just came so easily to her. But math was a different story altogether. And I mean, same, sister, math is hard. Even still, she kept studying and she kept pushing forward. And when it came time for her to apply for college, she took the ACTs, which was her first ever standardized test in her life. I cannot imagine how nervous she was. She actually did very well. So well, in fact, that she earned what she described as the largest merit-based scholarship for Arizona State University. Now, at that point, her plan was to double major, forever the high achiever, right? So she was going to double major in philosophy and music. These are two things that she loved and had always excelled at. But just as it seemed that everything was falling in place for Susan, she got some news that shattered everything. Her dad, who was only 56 years old at the time, had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. The doctor said that he would probably make it until Christmas, but even though Susan was preparing to start her freshman year at ASU, she made sure that she made the most of the time she had left with him. Due to his condition, his memory did start to fade, and eventually he no longer remembered his daughter. She would still regularly travel out from ASU to visit him, though, and right before an audition for her music major, she was really overwhelmed just by the gravity of the importance of this audition. So she traveled out to Mesa to be with her dad. He had always been her anchor, and she felt like she needed to be with him. He had actually recently been moved out to Mesa to a hospice facility, and she knew that he didn't have much time left. So she spent that entire day with him right by his side, and the very next morning, he was gone. Susan was obviously devastated. He had not made it to Christmas after all, and she still had to go back to her classes like her world didn't just come crashing down around her. That's the thing with tragedy, is that it doesn't care. You know, you still have life happening around you, and it's this weird dichotomy of, your personal life crashing down, but everything else is just still moving. It's such a surreal feeling. She went to her audition and she actually bombed it. So things at school from there just kind of continued to unravel. Ultimately, the semester just really slipped through her fingers, and she did end up withdrawing from her classes and actually had checked herself into a mental health facility. From there, she was really able to take that time and just grieve the loss of her dad and honestly come to terms with this life that she had spent in constant fight or flight as a result of growing up in such extreme poverty. When you think about it, if you're constantly not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, you end up existing in this constant state of anxiety. And so I think that stay in the mental health facility really turned things around from her. And so she was able to come back to ASU in the spring semester, and at this point she was determined to succeed and just honor her dad's memory with that success. That is really when everything started to fall into place for her. She took her first college-level science class during that semester and absolutely fell in love. The logic, the structure, the way the universe seemed to unfold through these formulas and forces, it lit up a part of her brain that she hadn't been able to access before. And she knew right then, she didn't want to be a musician or a philosopher. She wanted to be a physicist. There was, however, a tiny problem. Because of her non-traditional education and the gaps in her math background, she was years behind the typical physics track, and state schools like ASU just were not willing to let her take the remedial math courses that she would need in order to qualify for that major. So, in typical Susan fashion, she did something pretty bold. She applied to Ivy League schools. Not because she thought that she belongs there. She knew that a girl raised in extreme poverty just didn't fit the typical mold. But her hypothesis is that if they could see her potential in a way that the state schools didn't, that maybe they would let her take the math courses that she needed to get up to speed to qualify her for the physics track. So she made her case. She told them that yes, she was behind in math, but she was excelling in everything else. And she told them that she was willing to work harder than anyone. Now, all she needed was a chance. Well, the University of Pennsylvania said yes. And in 2014, Susan Fowler graduated with a bachelor's degree in physics. and this is a moment that she had fought for seemingly her entire life. From there, she entered the tech world. She was eager, she was brilliant, and she was ready to finally build the life that she had worked so hard for so long to earn. And she took a couple of roles at smaller startups, but then she got her big break at Uber, or at least that's what it looked like from the outside. In 2015, Uber is pretty much everywhere. Since their founding in 2009, they had gone from a luxury black car app in San Francisco to a full-blown global powerhouse. They were in over 60 countries and valued in the billions. They were expanding so fast that it was almost hard for them to keep track. Investors like Beyoncé and Jay-Z were just throwing money at them. Headlines called them the fastest growing startup in the world. But behind all the hype, this company was built on absolute, utter chaos. Uber's rise wasn't just about innovation. It was about domination. They didn't just want to disrupt the taxi industry. They wanted to absolutely obliterate it. And they did not care who or what they had to bulldoze to get there. The culture was ruthless, aggressive, and, of course, male-dominated. This was the kind of place where executives bragged about bending the rules and where HR intentionally covered up violations time and time again. And where toxic behavior wasn't just tolerated, it was practically rewarded. And into all of that walked Susan Fowler. She's fresh out of college, brilliant, hopeful, and completely unaware of what she was about to face. Even though she had performed extensive research into what the company supposedly stood for on the outside, she had no idea what she was going to walk into. She made the choice to join Uber as a site reliability engineer, also known as an SRE, in late 2015. An SRE is basically the person responsible for making sure that the systems that support the app's functionality behind the scenes don't break. They build tools, they monitor performance, and they jump in when things kind of go sideways. Think of them as like the tech world's version of first responders mixed with architects that design systems instead of buildings. It is a demanding job. It's highly technical, it's high pressure, and it requires serious problem-solving skills. So Susan was a critical part of the infrastructure team, and it was a great fit for her. It was supposed to be her dream job. She just graduated with a physics degree from the University of Pennsylvania. This was a huge accomplishment on its own, especially considering where she came from. And now she was stepping into one of the most talked about tech companies in the world. She was smart and scrappy and ready to prove herself. But 3 weeks into this brand new fancy job, fresh out of Uberversity, which is the company's intensely rigorous orientation, her manager sent her a message. It wasn't about the job or the team or onboarding. No, of course not, because that would just be silly. He sent her a message letting her know that he was in an open relationship and was actively looking for a woman to have sex with. I mean, it was brazen, entirely unprofessional, and completely inappropriate. Any illusion that Susan might have had about the kind of company that she was walking into was shattered. She had practically skipped to work each day, thrilled to have this incredible opportunity. She had an immense amount of optimism and hope, but unfortunately, this was just the beginning of what would become the most difficult year in her professional life. When she reported it, she was told that it was the manager's first offense, and he was a high performer, so HR just didn't feel comfortable reprimanding such a valuable member of the company, outside of anything other than a stern conversation. Ultimately, Susan was given a choice. She could switch teams or stay and most likely face retaliation for reporting him when it came time for her performance review, which she was also told wouldn't actually be considered retaliation in the eyes of HR because, after all, she was given the opportunity to switch teams. So what else could she do? except switch teams and hope that it would be better with a new manager. As we've learned, Susan is not one to just give up on a dream, and she was determined to be successful at Uber. Later, she would learn that this exact same thing with this exact same manager had happened to several women in the engineering department. And over the next year, Susan and many other women would face sexism, sabotage, and systemic gaslighting from Uber's internal systems. The relentless abuse from managers and absolute and utter apathy from HR broke a lot of people. Many of them left the company, and one of them actually committed suicide. Susan carried the weight of what this environment could do to people, and she made a decision. If the company was going to refuse to hold people accountable, she was going to resolve to do what was good and what was right on her own. So she started calling out sexism when she saw it, demanding that management do something about it, and every single time they refused or something absolutely ridiculous happened as a result, Susan made sure that there was documentation for it. At the same time, she was planning her way out. She recognized that there was something systemically wrong with Uber, and there was very little that she could do as a junior level employee. So when she was offered an opportunity as the founding editor-in-chief of a new software engineering magazine, she jumped at the chance. Now, I know I may have buried the lead here a little bit, but not only is Susan an incredibly capable software engineer and physicist, oh, by the way, she is also an accomplished author. The CEO of the company that offered her the position of editor-in-chief had been very impressed by a blog post and several other things that Susan had written, and he wanted her on board to shape the entire vision of this new publication. Now, you might be thinking, wait, I thought you said that this episode was about the lady who took on Uber, but all you've done so far is talk about how she took notes about all of the atrocities at Uber. Well, my feral flock, I am about to get to that. Because while Susan was settling into her new role, doing what most of us do after escaping a toxic job, trying to move the fuck on, something happened. Surprise, surprise, Uber made headlines again. Not because they were fixing things. Oh, no, that would be just absolutely ridiculous. But because they were denying that anything was ever broken. And that's when it occurred to her. If another friend or former coworker were to take their life and she had done nothing, she had said nothing, then she would feel like she was somehow responsible, and she just couldn't carry that weight. On February 19th, 2017, Susan Fowler hit publish on a blog post titled, "Reflecting on one very, very strange year at Uber." The post was a meticulous, factual, and strategically written exposure of Uber's internal culture. She didn't name call. She didn't speculate. She didn't exaggerate. She laid out exactly what had happened. The entire post, over 3,000 words, which I will link below in the show notes, had poured out of her in just an hour. But before she hit publish, before she put it out into the world, she went back through every single screenshot, every email, every incident report that she had ever saved, and made sure that every claim in that blog could be backed up by something solid. And then she submitted it. The internet, within hours, caught fire. Journalists picked it up. Employees from across the tech industry started sharing their own horror stories. Venture capitalists, the same ones who had once praised Uber's meteoric rise, suddenly had a PR crisis on their hands. And within days, Uber was forced to launch an internal investigation, all because of this blog that Susan Fowler published. But it wasn't just the company that came under scrutiny. It was the entire culture of tech. For the first time, the world was forced to reckon with the fact that Silicon Valley wasn't some utopia of innovation. It was a boys' club, one that had protected predators, dismissed women, and buried the truth under mountains of NDAs. Uber CEO at the time, Travis Kalanick, or TK, as he was referred to within the walls of the company, was already known for his brash, misogynistic behavior, but Susan's blog kicked off a chain reaction that would eventually force him to resign. The company lost executives, it faced lawsuits, and it tried desperately to rebrand, but they couldn't unring the bell. Because Susan's story wasn't just about Uber. It was about every woman who had ever been silenced. Every woman who had reported the harassment, followed the rules, gone to HR, and been manipulated or gaslit into submission as a result. But Susan refused to submit, and because she didn't, the truth finally came out, and it could not be ignored. But Susan's story is just one chapter in a much bigger book, one where women are punished for speaking up, punished for staying silent, and punished for simply existing in male-dominated spaces. And nowhere is that punishment more quietly enforced or more deeply embedded than in tech. This is an industry that loves to brand itself as progressive and disruptive. But when it comes to gender equality, it's still stuck in the 1950s. When Susan first started at Uber, the percentage of women in the engineering department was 25%, something that they bragged about. But by the time that she left in 2017, only a year later, a measly 3% of the department was women. In the US, women make up less than a third of the workforce in tech companies, and the higher up you go, the fewer women you see. Statistically speaking, only 11 to 17% of tech companies have a woman CEO. And this isn't because they aren't qualified. It's because of the culture. Leadership meetings, boardrooms, engineering teams are all dominated by men. And not just by any men, right? A specific type. White, rich, aggressive, and often intentionally perpetuating the exclusion happening around them. And here's the kicker. When women do make it in, they are constantly having to prove they belong. They're hired, but not listened to. They're promoted slower. They're paid less, but harassed more. And when they dare to speak up, they're labeled a problem, a risk, a liability, a bad culture fit. But it's the culture that's broken. The environment is intentionally hostile and egotistical, and not a vast contrast from our current government. The system was not built with women in mind. So when we dare to simply exist in spaces that were not inherently welcome, we're already seen as a disruption. But the truth is, the tech industry needs more disruptions like Susan Fowler. Because until the system is willing to make space for women, we have to keep making noise. Now, if you're a woman in tech, whether you have lived a story like Susan's or your experience has been completely different, and honestly, I hope that it has been, I want to hear from you. Have you felt silenced? Have you been overlooked? Or maybe you do work someplace that gets it right, a space where your voice is valued, where your boundaries are respected, where you don't have to fight to be believed. Either way, your story matters, and I would love to share it. And to every woman listening, whether you're in tech or not, thank you for being a part of this community, for holding space for each other, for telling the truth, and for refusing to be small. We're going to pick up a brand new case next Tuesday, but until then, you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at Another Feral Feminist. Or you can also email me. I would love to hear from you at anotherferalfeminist@gmail.com. Until then, stay loud, stay feral, and stay safe. Okay, I love you. Bye.